Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got Tyler Meredith as my guest tonight. He is an expert in the whole budget process, and so I thought it would be really good to check in with him in regards to the federal budget and the announcement and the contents, etc. He's a public policy entrepreneur and senior advisor to leaders past, head of the economic and fiscal policy for Justin Trudeau, Chrystia Freeland, and Bill Marneau. He is a founding member of a policy advisory group called Meredith Bosencool. And he's a very smart guy. I've heard him speak already, and I've read some of his pieces. I think it'll be an interesting conversation tonight. Thank you for joining us, Tyler.
Thanks for having me, Brian. Really appreciate the invitation.
So tell me, what do you think of the budget?
Well, it's an interesting choice of a budget for a third-year budget, right? Because governments typically get 4 budgets in the course of their mandate. And ordinarily, if you thought of a pre-election budget, you would think that that would be your last budget because you not necessarily want to run on that budget as your platform, but it kind of sets up the frame of what you want the election to be. In this particular case, partly because of the macroeconomic backdrop with interest rates with the Bank of Canada, partly because of the inflationary environment, partly because of the political environment right now, this in some ways is a start to the pre-election process because it is a recognition that I think if the government wants to have a good shot in the next election, and we'll still see what that looks like, they realize that they need to actually get a bunch of stuff moving and done by the time we get to that place next year. And especially on housing, that is so critical right now. And so this budget is all about housing. It's about the Canada Disability Benefit. It's about a national school food program, but it's also about wanting to have a fight about fairness. And so that is the kind of stuff that you would ordinarily be doing in a 4th year. This is a 3rd year, and it reflects the current political environment.
So the week before the budget, they had an announcement on housing almost every day, and some pretty radical big moves in housing, particularly for a prime minister that, when was it, last August, said that housing isn't a prime responsibility of the federal government. And now it almost is his number one priority. What do you think of the housing measures that they've included in the budget?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the government has been dealing with the reality that the federal government pulled out of affordable housing for years, right? The federal government actively cut investments in affordable housing in the late 80s through the 90s. That was a choice for a bunch of reasons of successive governments, from Mulroney all the way through to basically when Mr. Trudeau came back, right? And so when you stepped out of funding affordable housing for as long as this government did, it's very hard to get back in and to get back in a serious way and in a way that can deliver programs as effectively as if we had stayed in the game longer for longer. But I say that because that is why when the National Housing Strategy started in 2017, remember, Brian, the first version of the National Housing Strategy, before we even heard any of this stuff last week, right? That is why the government had to reinvest in rebuilding its own capacity. And we've actually started to see significant progress on that, even if I think a lot of us may not see that in our daily lives. There's been over 100,000 units built of affordable housing in the last 8 years, all as a result of the federal government coming back in. That's 3 times faster than we've seen in the private market, but obviously not anywhere near as fast as is needed. And so you get this building pressure that the government needed to respond to starting last summer. And I think what you've seen is, while the Prime Minister may have been slow, per your comment, to kind of acknowledge that actually you need to go into to a higher gear here. They actually went back to the drawing board and came up with a second version of the National Housing Strategy that I think by all measures is one of the most comprehensive documents we've, certainly in my recollection, that I've ever seen any government produce on housing, that deals with everything from the tax system to how we think about loan financing and the cost of financing for private developers, to how we think about a renter's bill of rights, to how we think about the use of and strategic deployment of public lands, the way in which we need to employ the skilled trades. It really has covered off pretty much every issue that you could think about as to what may be holding back certain parts of our housing market. Now, that is going to take 10 years to have a real impact, right? But my point is, if you're looking for comprehensive action, despite with the Prime Minister's perhaps poor choice of words last summer, I think he's really gotten the message.
They positioned a lot of the housing policies as almost a generational inequity, almost a rights issue or an equity issue between generations. What did you think about that positioning?
Well, I mean, I think it reflects the reality that a lot of people face, right? So if you drew a graph that showed the rate of home ownership over successive generations, we went through a history in this country where it effectively continued to go up for people under the age of 30 consistently for decade after decade after decade. That trend starts to reverse about a decade ago. So the mid 2010s is when we started to see people delaying family formation. Family formation being delayed in part because of higher education. That's natural. That makes sense. But then, of course, a very expensive housing market is now suddenly a barrier for people to actually own a home and to be able to form a family on their own. And so we've actually seen the rate of home ownership amongst people in their 30s having dropped several percentage points compared to your generation or my parents' generation. And so that is an intergenerational equity issue, right? Because if you consider the significant tax sheltered gains that anyone who's had been fortunate to be able to get into the housing market has realized, right? That sets up over time a reality that if you're not able to own a portion of housing, you've missed out on probably the best asset class in the course of the last 40 years. And just from a perspective of how people see themselves and how they see the role of success over the course of subsequent generations, you get very toxic dynamics when that goes unchecked for a long time.
It almost seems like they think that municipal governments are the problem, and they're using a $2.4 billion infrastructure fund to, I don't know whether you call it incentivize or bribe, but to offer it up only if local municipalities do what they want in regards to a couple of things. I guess it's number one, as of right, abilities to build a fourplex in a single family home, increased density and height around transit stations. Is that the right thing for federal governments to do? Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, certainly doesn't think so.
Well, I think you can look at this from several standpoints, right? I'd say probably the of all the different tools that the federal government has deployed, of all the billions of dollars the federal government has deployed over the course of the last decade on housing, and it's done lots of different things. To my point about having built 100,000 units of affordable housing, probably the one that has grabbed the most attention and the one that has been able to move the dial as quickly of all of them in terms of being able to make structural reforms, not just being able to actually push more projects into construction, but to actually make structural reforms to how we develop things and to how we are able to potentially speed up the process of building something, because it takes, even after something is permitted today, 18 months to potentially build something. The single most significant tool that we've used so far is the Housing Accelerator Fund. You'll remember the $4 billion fund that the Prime Minister announced in the 2021 campaign, which he said would help incentivize municipalities to be able to speed up construction. By the way, an idea that he came to well before Pierre Poilievre started talking about doing the same thing. And so having seen that success play out with deals having been inked with municipalities all across the country, right? And in some cases, yes, getting some communities like Windsor having said no to the money. And that was a fight probably the government wanted to have. Having seen that success, they kind of said, well, let's take this a step further. Let's enhance the Housing Accelerator Fund, and let's also put some money into the enabling infrastructure, actually very similar to some of what Doug Ford has been doing, notwithstanding their fights over fourplexes, in order to help municipalities be positioned to be able to actually unlock this growth. And I think, if you'll permit me, Brian, for just 30 more seconds, I think there is an issue with municipalities in this respect. And this is maybe where I would go a step farther than the federal government. So in the federal framework, they require municipalities to freeze development charges. We know that the cost of development charges and user fees are a huge portion of what makes up the cost of housing now. Arguably, we actually need to go farther and bring that down. And I think if you look at municipal finances across the country, you will see that cities are sitting on lots of excess reserves that could be deployed today, where we could actually take a complete holiday on development charges or even lower them going forward.
Some people think development charges are just a slush fund for municipalities.
Well, I think there is a significant debate that we need to have as a society about what is the way in which we want to tax ourselves for the delivery of municipal services. Do we tax the existing property tax base, or do we tax the future, right? So in Ontario, the property tax base is about $20-some billion, and development charges constitute about $2 billion. So effectively, it's a 10-to-1 ratio between development charges that we take in, and the property tax base. There's no reason that if you look at the existing reserves, certainly in communities like I'm from Ottawa, if you look at Toronto and parts of the GTA, the same thing is true. You could run those reserves without having to collect any new dollar today for the next several years. You could run down those reserves and still be able to manage the existing amount of development that is currently on the books without having to collect one more dollar of development charges. That's how much extra cushion we have. It represents excess taxation, and it represents excess taxation on the future, which means that it is a higher price that we are passing on to young people who are trying to get into the housing market.
How's that fair? You know, you think about, I understand it's like $140,000 or something like that,
Yes.
a housing unit. And the people that are paying that, as you say, are young people that are trying to buy their first home, or newcomers to our community that are buying their first home, or renters that want to buy their first home. And it's to pay for, you know, general municipal services.
Yes.
And our population is expanding. So one would think that it's, you know, incredibly regressive. And it really is you know, something that society is growing. Shouldn't everyone share in that tax burden?
I agree. No, I absolutely agree, especially because we will, as you say, recoup that in the form of other forms of economic activity just by permitting and enabling that infrastructure. In fact, arguably, one of the biggest economic challenges that we face as a country today is actually our housing market. It's probably the biggest chokehold on growth, because if you think about what has propelled Canada to be successful, what has propelled Ontario to be very successful in the last number of years, right? Our tech sector in Canada has grown immensely. It's outpaced Silicon Valley, it's outpaced parts of the Northeast and other parts of the world, in part because we have relatively low labor costs, right? And we have a very talented workforce. Except we will not be able to retain that workforce if we have a very costly housing market and we become like Silicon Valley, right? People don't want to live in San Francisco because it is an exceptionally expensive place to live. It's a fun place to live, but it's an exceptionally expensive place to live. And so if we lose that affordability, we will not get future investments and growth coming here. And so we have got to be able to solve this problem. And in fact, I saw just before the budget, KPMG actually did a survey of the C-suite of about 500 CEOs in Canada. The number one issue that they were all worried about going into this budget wasn't taxes; it was about housing. So I think back to your earlier comment about the budget, this budget sets a foundation for growth that isn't just about intergenerational fairness. It is actually intimately connected to our future economic challenge if we can't deal with the housing market today.
I saw a report today that pre-construction condos this year are down 71%. From last year. Seems like we're building a bigger hole for ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is what's challenging, right? Is that we have historically high levels of activity going on in the construction sector. Construction and real estate as a share of GDP is actually, on average, much higher in Canada than it is in a lot of other countries, partly because real estate is very expensive. And so it creates that value, right? But yet, despite that, and despite having a high amount of people even working in the sector, we still can't keep up with the growth, right? And especially with interest rates being as high as they are, I think we are now starting to see a potential leveling off of projects. And this is what's, this is what challenges, because if we can't keep up with that demand, right? That supply can't keep up with demand because we just can't bring the projects on because it's too expensive or we can't find the labor, right? The price problem that we've been facing in the market is only going to get worse.
What's gone wrong? You know, CMHC came out with a report that I saw that said that we're building the same number of housing units today that we were building in the 1970s. And yet the population has grown by what, a factor of 2.5?
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, it's a multifaceted problem. So one of it is a productivity problem, right? So we talk a lot about productivity as a general problem across the economy, but part of it is actually how we build. And this is where some of the more micro investments that were made in the housing plan around modular housing are actually quite important, because we really need to look at ways in which we can bring more capital and technology to speed up the process of construction, right? Like the way we build a house today, different, obviously, if we're talking about a big condo tower, but the way we build a house today is not that much different than the way we used to build it, right, 50 or 60 years ago. You can't find a lot of other industries where it's been that resistant to technological change, right, over time. So we have a technology and productivity problem. That's one. Number two is we do have a labor problem. We need to be able to find more skilled labor to be able to draw into the construction trades, in part because that workforce is relatively old compared to other workforces. And we have not been able to bring in as many skilled trades immigrants as we have in past cohorts. So that's actually an area where the federal government probably could do more. And I think it is looking at what it could do on that front. And then the other piece, right, is that we've made housing very expensive, right, to build. And so it, in fact, perversely incentivizes developers to sit on projects and to release them into the market at the right time. Obviously, right now is a very expensive time to be able to try to build because of the cost of financing. But given how well projects have, how well asset prices have risen in the real estate sector over the last number of decades, you haven't had a strong incentive to be able to bring new projects into construction as quickly as perhaps as it could. And I think one of the most interesting changes that comes in this budget is that for the portion of the market that is purpose-built rental, which is what we know, and there's been a lot of talk about how we need to reinvigorate how we build rental housing in this country, that's mixed market. One of the interesting things that this budget does is it effectively takes the depreciation rate, the accelerated capital cost rate, from 4% to 10%. And so there's a huge impact that's going to have potentially on unlocking projects to look much more profitable to be able to happen.
I think there's been numerous different impacts on rental housing. Maybe we should spend a couple of minutes talking about that, but we got to take a break for some messages, and we'll be back in just 2 minutes with Tyler Meredith talking about the federal budget. He's got a great experience at the federal government level, producing, analyzing, and talking about budgets. So we're going to take 2 minutes and be back with Tyler. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Tyler Meredith. He is a founder of an organization called Meredith Buzz and Cold Policy Advisors. He has previously been a senior fellow and sessional lecturer at the University of Toronto Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, a fellow with Maytree. And then for 2 years and 10 months, he was with Finance Canada as Director of Economic Strategy and Planning for the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, and Director of Policy to the Minister of Finance. Before that, he was the Senior Policy Advisor to the Liberal Caucus, Policy Advisor in the Office of the Prime Minister, Research Director, the Institute for Research on Public Policy, a Senior Consultant at KPMG, and got his start, it would appear, as Director of Policy and Research on a mayoral campaign for Alex Munter in Ottawa. And you've got an interesting academic background as well. You've got a Master's of Public Administration from Queen's University and a Bachelor of Science, Social Science from the University of Ottawa. Let's get back to rental, if we could. So they've taken off the GST, and with some provinces, the total HST on rental housing. CMHC is providing very attractive financing for rental housing. Now you've talked about this accelerated depreciation for rental housing. Why so much attention on rental housing?
Well, part of it is because if you look back over the course of the last several decades, the consequence of both the federal government pulling out its own direct subsidies for affordable housing projects, as well as some tax changes that happened in the late 70s and early 80s, meant that effectively we stopped building multi-residential construction from about the late 80s, early 90s through to the 2010s. And so it wasn't really until just about the time that this prime minister came into power, that you started to see that huge construction boom, right? Of a lot of projects that were actually custom-built, purpose-built rental, that weren't just condos that were being repurposed as investment properties back into rental, right? If you look back over those 25 years or so, in the period when we weren't building rental buildings, we were building a lot of multi-residential, but we were building multi-residential that was for ownership purposes, and those condos, effectively about a third of them in some cases, turned back over into rental. So that was the net growth in our rental stock, was coming from those condos. It wasn't coming from your traditional, your traditional rental buildings, which are targeted at a group in the market that is not necessarily poor, but certainly has perhaps less means, or is in the process of trying to save up for a down payment on a home. And so the absence of that supply growth meant that as our population grew, we put more and more pressure on both the rental market and the people who were competing in the rental market who might otherwise have found their way into other parts of the market, right? So it led to a lot of pressure and a lot of dysfunction. And if you graph over time the total housing stock in Canada, so not just purpose-built rental, just total housing starts and completions relative to the growth of the population adjusted for household size, we continue to be in balance. Basically, like we're growing our housing stock with our population all the way through about until the early 90s. And then that imbalance starts and it accumulates. It grows and grows and grows and grows and grows. And so by the time we start to see these massive price pressures really building in the housing market in the last 8 years, it's the combination of 35 years of inaction, right? And that is a multi-government inaction problem. It's not one government. It's not even this government's problem. It is a multi-government problem. But that's why it's so important that this government had to take action now.
What I hear in the development community is that one of the biggest concerns is rent control, and that we had rent control at one point in time that was only up to a certain year, and then all of a sudden the government comes in and changes it to the current year, and that people producing their pro formas today, their analyses as to whether it makes economic sense to actually go ahead, take a look at the accelerated depreciation, take a look at the GST reductions, take a look at the CMHC financing, but they don't know if they can trust government to not change rent control again.
Yeah, look, so there's a lot of literature that has been done on rent control. There are some mixed results, I will say that. I would say on balance, it tilts a bit in favor of suggesting that it does limit supply, and that has a long-term effect on prices. But that being said, there are some smart ways that you can do certain rental and tenant protection laws that don't have the effect of disincentivizing capital and investment. And, I think it may surprise some people to know that, right, that there are still some jurisdictions in Canada, irregardless of rent control in terms of trying to control the price increase and the price level, there are still some jurisdictions in Canada that have almost no protections for tenants, right? Like it wasn't until very recently, for example, in the Yukon, you could actually rip up a tenancy with no justification. You could literally still throw someone out with no justification. It wasn't actually until a supply and confidence agreement between the NDP and the Liberals in the Yukon this past year actually went to solve that. So I'm just saying, yes, you're right that rent control has, I think that is, for some landlords, has been a concern as to why they might not want to put more capital at play. The literature is not as clear on that.
That's it. It's very interesting. The CMHC and Stats Canada came out with a major report a couple of months ago that said that the time for approvals, the red tape and regulation, was the number one factor in the lack of housing starts. And they compared Canada versus other Western world countries, and said that Canada is the slowest of any of the G7 countries. United States, Australia were bad, but not nearly as bad. And most of the other G7 in Europe was actually reasonably prompt in the approvals. What is in the budget, or what's in the housing strategy to improve approval time period?
So this is why all of the structural changes that you mentioned at the beginning around, as of right development, for example, is so important. Because if we can do more things as of right, we don't require a new development application or a site control application to be able to have to be made when we're trying to build a certain density on, let's say, a property that used to be a single family home. Even just at those kind of modest level of densities, or even to go higher in places that have a substantial amount of transit potential, for example, right? That is going to take years potentially out of the process. When Brian, from your own experience and involvement in municipal politics, that there is a lot of angst that happens sometimes in a community where they can use the process to slow it down for years and years and years through appeals, right? And so the federal government can't obviously stick its hand into all aspects of planning. It can't, get involved in, say, what used to be the Ontario Municipal Board and that process, but it can try to standardize the way we look at density, right? And density is one part of how you speed up the process.
So BC has got, what is it, minimum of 12 stories if you're within 400 meters of a major transit intersection, not even a subway or a SkyTrain, but a bus exchange. Does that kind of change make sense? I think that the Housing Affordability Task Force that the provincial government in Ontario had, that I think was released like 2 years ago this month, had major transit station area increases in height and increases in densities of one of its recommendations that still hasn't yet been put in place.
Yes, absolutely. Transit intensification and intensification around transit oriented development is incredibly important. And, I think what's interesting in terms of the budget is that if you do a cross comparison of the federal government's housing plan and other ideas that are out there, it pretty much lines up, not exactly, but almost, at least in content, pretty close to what the BC government is doing on almost everything, right? And I just think that's interesting, because the problem in Vancouver is actually a lot more mature and developed as a problem than it is even in the GTA. But it's interesting that two governments have been able to kind of political stripes that are slightly different, have been able to take on this problem in a very coordinated way. And British Columbia is actually one of the few provinces that's seeing progress in terms of being able to grow housing starts year over year, a problem which in Ontario we have not made very much progress on. And I think it's interesting that the Premier, although if you look at the recommendations in the Ontario's Housing Affordability Task Force report, Ontario actually has actioned a number of those recommendations. They just haven't done the big stuff because the big stuff is hard and it requires some fights. And I think, as we all know, Doug Ford loves to be loved by people. He does not like to be unloved by people. And so he's not maybe willing to have those fights in a way that I think Sean Fraser and Justin Trudeau have both kind of realized there's actually a political reward in doing the hard stuff.
So let's talk about the political reward. I think what they're doing is trying to appeal to young people, because I do think that there is this incredible generational inequity that, when I was graduating from university, my dad told me that, buy a house that's 3 times your income. Today, it's like 9 or 12 times your income in the type of housing that people have got to pay. And that may even be for just if you're lucky, a 2-bedroom condo rather than actually a house. So prices have gone, and we all know this, through the roof. And it takes, what was it? A statistic said it takes 20 to 25 years for a typical 30-year-old to save a down payment, let alone, anything more than that. So do you think that this policy is going to appeal so dramatically to young people that they come out in droves and vote the Liberals back in?
So whether they will vote for Liberals is, I think, a different question than whether it changes their perception of the government and the Liberals, right? So Abacus Data actually had an interesting finding recently that showed that if you look at government approval or disapproval across different generations, amongst those under the age of 35 in the space of the last 6 months, approval has only gone up 1 point, but disapproval has gone down 11 points. So a 12-point change. That's a pretty substantial change in a relatively short period of time on a group that is, as you say, the target of all of this. I think what's interesting is how much people will have to kind of take this on trust versus whether they will see the action, right? Because the challenge in all of this is the solution, especially on the supply side of the housing market, is something that's going to take years to manifest, to build all of these homes that we know we need in order to drive down prices or to stabilize prices. That is beyond the horizon, the time horizon of this government that they have before the next election, and maybe even beyond the time horizon and the patience of a lot of young people. So the question then becomes, what else can they see, right? And that's where I think some of the stuff in the budget, especially the changes around the amortization periods for first-time home buyers, where if you're a first-time home buyer going into the market, buying a new or able potentially to buy a new unit that's being built as a condo or as a home, you're going to get an extra 5 years over which you can spread out that mortgage, which can save you potentially up to $500 a month. I mean, I don't know about you, Brian, but I think for young people, at least who are on the margin of being able to afford a mortgage, assuming that interest rates come down, $500 a month is a pretty substantial savings. And that, that will, I think that actually could help politically for the government. But this is the challenge is you got to show the goods, right? And back to the point we made at the beginning, the reason that this budget puts such an emphasis in a way that traditionally a third-year budget would not be doing this kind of stuff, it'd be much more of a status quo budget, is because they know they need to show the goods before the next election.
I think the amortization is potentially helpful. The problem is that comes with it, a bunch more interest because you're going to have the principal outstanding, the loan outstanding for a longer period of time. I think that the change they should have made is to the stress test. I think that the stress test was the right thing to put in place when interest rates were really low and there was a risk of interest rates going up. Well, interest rates are up. And so, you don't need that stress test anymore. And the problem is rental rates are so high today. And maybe this is just in major urban markets, but I think, generally so. Rental rates are so high, they're effectively comparable to what a mortgage payment would be. And yet, even if you can afford that rental payment or that mortgage payment, you're not allowed to make that mortgage payment because you got that stress test on top. And so I think that, what they should have done is either reduce the stress test or taken off the stress test and said, but we'll put it back on when interest rates go below X, and say interest rate stress tests are completely appropriate when interest rates are lower than we think they're going to be through a whole cycle. But now's not the time because that's a huge incentive for people to actually buy today.
So I have to tell you, I have a complicated view on this about the stress test because I hear exactly what you're saying, and the former political staffer in me agrees with you that is a problem that needs to be addressed. And I will also say, both as a policy expert and as somebody who spent a lot of time in government when we developed the stress test, I don't think the stress test has worked very well. It has actually significantly improved credit quality today in a way in which we've been able to actually get through this the tightest and most severe period of tightening of financial conditions that we've ever seen since the Second World War. We've gotten through that actually fairly well, despite how frustrating it has been for many households. There's not a lot of delinquencies and mortgages that are happening. So it's improved credit quality. And I also agree that the stress test is not as well suited as a tool, say, compared to other things like loan to income ratios and stuff like that, that could actually test the household's total ability to afford something, which is really what we care about when we're trying to assess someone's ability to pay. All of that being said, however, you've got two problems with changing the stress test. First problem is the Minister of Finance only controls the insured mortgage space, which is today about 18% of new mortgage origination. So the biggest part of the lever that could actually attack the stress test is owned by the Superintendent of Financial Institutions. The Superintendent of Financial Institutions cannot legally be directed by the Minister of Finance. So Peter Rutledge would have to come to his own wisdom that is the right thing to do. I can pretty much guarantee you that Peter Rutledge would not do that on his own. So you'd have two markets with two very different rules. That's maybe not a good thing. And the other problem is I'm not sure that it would actually have the immediate impact that we think it would. And I think that's why I come to the conclusion that the best thing to do is to actually change the amortization rules and maybe even to look at the definition of the insured market, because those are the things that are going to change the equation that someone, once they qualify, will have to go through in terms of what they can actually afford in a given month.
Fascinating conversation, but we got to take another break. When we come back, I'm going to turn off of housing and ask about capital taxes and productivity, prosperity, growth agenda, some of the other issues that have come up. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got a very smart finance guy, political guy with me tonight. Tyler Meredith is his name. Tyler, the company that you're with, do you have a website that you should tell people about so they can go and check out your writings, your papers, or is there another website they can go to or follow you on Twitter, or what's the best thing?
Probably the best way is to follow me on Twitter at Tyler Meredith, TylerMeredith. You'll see me link and comment on lots of stuff. Our corporate website is mbpolicy.com.
mbpolicy.com. Thanks so much. So, I've interviewed a couple of different people that think that we've got a huge productivity problem, innovation problem, prosperity problem. And it's because the Liberal government does not have, frankly, smart business people like one of your previous bosses, Bill Marneau, in cabinet. And they're all career people. And we therefore do not have a growth agenda or prosperity agenda. And they're all about redistribution rather than growing the pie. What do you think about that?
It's poppycock. I mean, it's like people can say that. People who say that have, in my opinion, never read a budget between 2015 and today. Because every budget has had a significant number of measures directed at trying to address productivity and growth. Why? Because every finance minister going as far back as the 80s has been concerned about productivity and growth. And you know what, Brian? We haven't found an answer to productivity and growth because it's super complicated. And we actually, we've tried lots of tools. And here's the reality. A lot of it hasn't worked. But also, it isn't maybe as big of a problem as we think it is for two reasons. Number one, if you look at other countries on the basis of real GDP per capita, which is, an indicator that a lot of people have talked about recently, if you look at all of the other big countries in the world, most of the countries that have larger GDP per capita are countries that either have resource wealth or are tax havens. But also, if you look at countries that are bigger than us, meaning can you, as you grow to be a bigger and bigger country, now we're 40 million people or more, can you actually keep up your standard of living as measured by real GDP per capita? Does it slow, right? And what we find is that there's only two other countries in the world that are both bigger in population and have bigger real GDP per capita than us, Germany and the United States. Obviously, the United States is a much more dynamic economy than Canada, and I think we all know why it is difficult to try to replicate being the United States. We should try, but it's difficult. But maybe we could be a little bit more like Germany, right? And so my point is, when you think of it that way, it's not actually as bad as a problem. But the second reason why this maybe isn't as big of a problem is because there's been some very interesting research done recently by some folks at McMaster University that have found that when you look at total factor productivity, so not just labor productivity, trying to control for all ways in which productivity is affected in terms of total output, right, including capital, not just hours worked. When you look at total factor productivity and you look at it intersectorally, so looking at does the manufacturing sector in Ontario and in Canada, how does it compare to the manufacturing sector in the United States? How does the financial services sector in Canada compare to the financial services sector in the United States? When you do an intersectoral comparison, Canada-US, what you find is that after you control for the fact that Canada has very expensive natural resources to get out of the ground, right? When you control for that fact, and those are a much larger share of our GDP than other countries, we actually have had a total factor productivity growth that is exactly on par with the United States for the last number of decades. So I say all of this because it's not that we shouldn't focus on this problem, but it is not as one-sided and one-directional of a problem as some people have made it out to be.
And yet people will say that real disposable income in Canada hasn't grown in 15 years. That, a decade ago, we had real disposable income comparable to the United States. Now we're at 71% of the United States. How do you true that with what you've just said?
So I think there's two factors that go on. So one is because we have a larger share of our economy that's dedicated to resources, we are much more susceptible to changes in commodity cycles, right? And you see that when you just plot a graph about income or GDP, it is quite lumpy with global commodity cycles, right? We had a significant drop off in capital investment and a significant unemployment that happened in Canada as we dropped from 2014 basically until about 2016, when WTI prices and and Brent crude prices just dropped through the floor, right? And that was just one of several commodity shocks that we've experienced over the course of the last decade. So Canada's a lot more susceptible on an income basis because of that. And when you look under the surface, if you look at after-tax income, after post-tax, post-transfer income, actually what we see is that incomes have actually been growing faster over time. And that in part is, yes, a function of government transfer programs, things like the Canada Child Benefit, but that's okay, right? The middle class actually has more money in its pocket. And this I know some people are going to probably think that this is untrue, but it is empirically true. The middle class has more money in its pocket on an after-tax, after-transfer basis, which has grown faster under Justin Trudeau than it did under under Stephen Harper.
Okay, so number one, I'd like to see the statistic, and you're right that people won't believe that statistic. But if it's true, How come the prime minister hasn't been talking about it? How come that message hasn't gotten through?
So he does talk about it. I think the challenge, though, is the government doesn't advertise, right? It just doesn't advertise for reasons, in part because they are gun shy, I think, of not being accused of the same partisanship that the Harper government took on when it did the Economic Action Plan. I think that's a kind of a ludicrous thing to be concerned about, but regardless, it is, I think, one of the reasons why they're risk averse to spending on an advertising campaign. And when Corey Tenike, our dear friend, goes on, other podcasts and says, I really think these guys should just bite the bullet and actually go and do some advertising. I wouldn't criticize them for doing it. We should probably listen to him. He's right. And when you don't advertise, when your facts are not out there, right, in the different kind of information worlds that each of us now live in, because we have such a fragmented media market, it's very difficult to penetrate, right? And this is why Pierre Poilievre is actually doing very well, because he smartly put a lot of money into an advertising campaign last summer, and the premier is doing the same thing, right, to reinvigorate themselves and to get right in front of people's screens in a way that they can't do if they're just doing press conferences every day.
Okay, I got to ask you, was this capital gains tax increase or the higher inclusion rate a smart policy, or given every single article in the Globe and Mail I see and lots of comments online, really dumb?
Well, so a couple of things. I would say that it was probably the most obvious and least worst choice that they could pull on, if given the need to generate some revenue that allows them to invest into the $12 billion housing plan that is required, right? So a significant amount of revenue is required today because we have an abundance problem, right? We need more houses, we need more healthcare, more defense, more action on climate change. The things that we need to do as a society has only grown. And if we don't adequately pay for those things, we are going to not only have a deficit in the short term, but we're going to create massive liabilities to future generations that we will not pay for. My generation, as we get older, are going to want to make sure that we are dealing with climate change, right? In the same way that we want to deal with housing. So they need money, especially for things even just like defense, right? And so there's not a lot of ways that you could tax that would have that degree of revenue impact, that aren't necessarily going to be broad-based, right? So capital gains is interesting because it does deal with a fairness problem in that we have what some people have called the Buffett curve, where if you draw what the average effective tax rate is across the income distribution, right, it continues in a progressive path upwards as you go up the income distribution until you get to about the top 0.1%. And then it comes down. And so the person in the top 0.1% in Canada on average pays an average tax rate that is much more similar to someone in the 80th or 90th percentile. And so that is the problem. And the reason that happens is because a lot of people who are in the top 0.1% tend to take their income not in the form of salary, but in the form of capital income, which has been significantly privileged relative to salary since Jean Chrétien made the decision to drop the inclusion rate from 75 to 50, along with other personal income tax changes, which, by the way, Brian, when we made those massive income tax cuts back in the early 2000s, it was on the premise that it would improve productivity and income, which we have not seen. So clearly that did not work. And so if that did not work to help improve productivity and growth, and we have this massive problems, it's time to invest, and this is a fair way to do it.
Tyler Meredith, this has been really interesting. I really appreciate it. I got to ask you one final question before I let you go, since you're such a smart guy and you've been involved in finance for a long time. I think that the carbon tax is the smartest way of any kind of rule, regulation, tax to help climate change. But it's been getting a really raw deal, attacked left, right, and center by provincial premiers, by the leader of the opposition, etc. Should they have gotten rid of the carbon tax? Should they have axed the tax?
Well, I mean, so you mean like, would that have improved their political fortunes?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that the challenges politically that the government is facing are not because of the carbon price, right? Like if you actually ask people, for example, on food costs, which is a big concern that a lot of people have, it's one of the top things that people complain about in public opinion polls. About 36% of people will say that the number one reason that prices have increased is because of corporate pricing behavior. Only 2% of people will say that's because of the carbon price. 6% of people will say, 7% of people will say it's because of climate change. So people actually don't make the link between the cost of living and carbon pricing. They just hate paying taxes, and they don't like that the carbon price is a visible tax when they go to the pump. So they still want to have.
That's the whole idea. That's the whole reason why it's beneficial.
Absolutely, but my point is they are buying into the slogan of "Axe the Tax." They're not actually rejecting necessarily the policy, and for a government that's 9 years in office, you tend to become unpopular after 8 or 9 years. That's a natural thing. What we're seeing today is a natural occurrence of the life of a government, not necessarily a revolt, or not entirely about a revolt over this one policy that in and of itself is not as unpopular as people think.
Tyler Meredith, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody.